When I say that it was no fun really being a fiction writer or almost any kind of writer in the United States in 1820, what I mean by that is the fact that we have to cover a little historical background here. Some people don't like history. I'll try not to be too dry and boring. But we have to look at what the literary marketplace looked like in the first couple of decades or so of the 19th century. We're talking about from about 1810 to 1820 to about 1830. There were a lot of things that were taking place at the time or were in place at the time that you have to think about. And when you do think about it, it makes a lot of sense that, gee, it must have been tough to be a writer at that time. I'll give you an example of that. Right after the Revolution, the population in the United States in the original 13 colonies expanded westward very, very rapidly. In fact, one of the reasons that most people don't tell you about that the Revolutionary War was fought for was because the settlers there, who had occupied a great deal of the land, the economy was booming, the population was booming, and frankly, the need on the part of a number of new settlers and immigrants for cheap, basically free land that you could settle, the pressure for that was tremendous. The political pressure was tremendous. The British did not want, for fear of causing more conflict with the French, to allow these settlers, the colonists, to move west as fast as the colonists would like to. So you got this growing population of individuals who are primarily farmers, and they've run out of cheap, easy farmland to clear and settle, and they wanted to move west. Some of them did it without permission, in fact. Many of them did. Went into the Tennessee Valley, into Kentucky and Ohio in these areas, but this is strictly off limits for the British. They said don't go there. They didn't want to create any more problems for themselves in foreign policy, and so they bottled up the colonists in some ways. But when the revolution's over, of course, all of those restrictions are lifted. American settlers were able to move westward, and they did so very, very quickly. What does that lead to? Well, that leads to several different things. Number one, literacy rates actually declined. If you look at the East Coast, and you look at the major cities like Baltimore and Philadelphia and Boston and New York and Savannah and Charleston and these sorts of places, during the Revolution, many, many people lived in these large cities, or you weren't very far from a large city. Oh, you were a day's ride or maybe two from a large city, so you could go to a large city fairly often. Well, what do cities have? Cities have things like libraries, thanks to Ben Franklin. Cities have things like bookstores. They have schools. They have all kinds of venues whereby individuals can engage in literacy acquisition, learning, okay, learning to read and write. But as populations become more dispersed throughout the West, you've got whole generations of people, or at least a generation of people, growing up on the frontier without formal education, sometimes without even any books in the house at all, except maybe the family Bible, and then maybe Pa or Grandma knew how to read it, and the kids really grew up not knowing how. So in some respects, that and the fact that we had a tremendous influx of immigration into the country, and we're talking German immigrants and Dutch immigrants and French immigrants who didn't know English at all when they even arrived there, but became farmers, and eventually their children and grandchildren would learn English, but they didn't know English at the time. We really were a very multilingual society at that point. So the overall effect is that, believe it or not, literacy rates from about the 1790s to about 1825 or 1830 actually declined and bottomed out. We actually went backwards in terms of our literacy rate in the country. Nobody knows for sure exactly what the literacy rates were like, but suffice it to say that a smaller percentage of Americans in the United States of America in 1820 knew how to read and write than in the 1790s. Now the population was bigger, but as a percentage of the population, the literacy rates declined, and there are reasons. Now, also another big problem is this: is that we had no railway at the time. There were no highways, there were no railroads, anything like that. There's no FedEx, and so transportation is very, very difficult. You're riding a mule over the mountain pass, through the woods, down by the river. In some places, a canal system had begun, but for the most part, getting from one place to another was extremely difficult. And so that means that shipping things or trucking things in was very difficult. So, if you ever went through the Smoky Mountains or the Appalachians, it's a really tough terrain. Even today, it's a tough drive sometimes in a car. Imagine what it would be like on horseback or in a wagon, and how expensive it would be to transport stuff. Only the most important things were brought out west: tools, farming implementation, seeds, basic resources, and books might or might not be part of that. So getting books out to a reading audience that is very diffused throughout the countryside was difficult, but that's okay because most of them couldn't read anyway, right? But if that's not enough, if those two things aren't enough, think about this third issue, and that is that we didn't have a real central banking system until late in the Jacksonian period. Instead, people largely were agricultural, rural. They traded. It was a barter economy. And so some guy out in Tennessee or Ohio or Kentucky or Alabama who's growing stuff, even if he can read, even if he's just dying to get the latest bestseller and is willing to wait months for it to arrive on a wagon from back east, what's he going to pay with? Chickens? Well, the chicken won't make it back to Hawthorne, who frankly doesn't want to be paid in chickens, you see? And so there's no banking system out there. Your bank is your general store. You go in and you sell your produce at the store. He gives you a credit on the books, and you buy things like flour and coffee and basic things like linens and stuff like that. People didn't have money. They had goods and agricultural products. So in an environment like that, it's very difficult to be paid. So you're in a city where, the population's not really increasing. You've got very few people outside the city who can read and write. You've got no way to get books to them. Even if you got books to them, there wasn't a lot of money. But on top of that, there's an even bigger issue, and that is there were very few American publishing houses. And by that I mean bookmakers, right? Booksellers. Today we've got all kinds of booksellers. We've got Houghton Mifflin, and we've got Little Brown, and we've got all of these different types of book companies, publishers that are Norton, all these. Many of them do date all the way back to the 19th century. They're some of the oldest companies in America. But at the time, they were teeny tiny. They didn't have a lot of money, and so they were kind of family-run businesses, and there weren't very many of them. So here's the thing. If you're an American publishing firm and you're a mom and pop outfit and you publish a certain number of authors and you've got one printing factory and bindery, you're gonna probably want to sell copies of bestsellers from back in England. It's a safer bet economically to put out yet another Charles Dickens novel. He's well known. There's a lot of advertising for it, and if you publish that, you're probably going to sell. The problem with undercapitalized or small businesses, they can't take chances very much. They can't take risks. One big flop, if you're a filmmaker, for example, and if you're an independent filmmaker, all it takes is one big flop and you're bankrupt, you're gone. MGM or Fox or Pixar can put out a flop and they'll live through it because they've got a lot of money. But a tiny little film company, for example, couldn't survive if their one and only big investment for the year goes down the drain and nobody goes and sees it. Same thing with book companies. So book companies, publishing houses, American ones, were unwilling to take risks on American authors that were unproven. And so they would frequently ask people, remember the story about Thoreau? And he had to pay for his own publishing? So there you go. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Publishing houses said, you're a fine young man and you're a nice writer and everything, but we just can't go and front the money for this unless you're a proven writer, unless you're somebody that we think is a safe bet, because if we bet the farm or the publishing firm on you and we lose, that's the end of us. But now, a lot happened in the Jacksonian era. That's the 1820s. There's old Hickory there down in the bottom. That changed all of that. One of the things that happened was that the westward expansion had grown. Yes, it's true. But you had a little bit more transportation links out west. And you had people eventually starting towns and villages and county courthouses start popping up and schools start popping up. And people begin with that next generation of settlers to decide that teaching their children at least a little bit of reading and writing was important. The barter economy is still in effect, but you have a banking system on the East Coast that's largely integrated by that point. We hadn't yet gotten to the Panic of 1837. That comes a little later, but prior to the Panic of 1837, you've got a banking system that's finally in place, and you can actually subscribe or get magazines, for example. Books are very heavy, books are very expensive, but magazines were a great way to go. And so you get people like Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne and some of these folks publishing not necessarily books early in their career, but short stories and poems, because they can get paid really quickly by the magazine, Atlantic Monthly or Southern Literary Messenger or Putnam's or something like this. They'll pay you by the page. You get cash on the barrelhead as soon as you turn the story in, and it'll get sent out in magazines. Who knows where? Cleveland, Ohio, or Cincinnati, or someplace, Lexington, Kentucky, or wherever. And they'll eventually find their way out there. Magazines are a lot lighter weight, and people like magazines because you can read short stories and poems, but you can also catch up on the news from back east. And so the magazine trade was really what most authors early in the 19th century, that's how they got their name out, that's how they got their stuff in print, not by printing some book, because it was cost-intensive, heavy. It was also more expensive to buy a book than a magazine. You could just walk into the general store, and people could borrow magazines or trade them or swap them, and books were kind of pricey. So the Jacksonian era brought about a little bit more banking, more transportation, a period where we were democratizing the education system. The frontiers began to develop towns and villages, and a real beginning of an economy got started.